at UNDP. He will present us today with basic facts and figures on the ocean plastics pollution status, what are the key trends and challenges that people are finding in fighting that pollution, and highlight some of the tools and strategies that have worked in the past. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today. Once you've completed your presentation, people can ask questions in the chat or verbally, and we'll have a conversation. If we have some time left and there are questions about the incubator or team formation or mentors, please feel free to ask them at the end of this session. So without further delay, Andrew, I'll let you present and start the session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa, very much. My audio good? You can hear me well?
Yes, thank you.
Very good. Okay, so I'm going to do this a bit free form, sort of dive right in and sort of talk about the issue. And yeah, we should have plenty of time at the end for some questions to be discussed. Yeah, I guess just to start, I'm sure you've seen some of the global numbers of the amounts of plastics that are being produced in the world and the amounts that are getting in the ocean. We're producing upwards of 400 million metric tons of plastic products every year now. It's been growing quite rapidly for many decades since plastics really came onto the situation in the 50s. And then, of course, in the recent years, we've seen that the amount that is escaping waste management systems and so forth from municipalities and other reasons, escaping into the oceans is on the order of 5 to 12 million tons per year. We know a lot of that. We don't know the exact amount, but there's no question a lot of it is getting in through rivers. Again, no big surprise, because in addition to large population centers on the coast, there's also very large population centers on the world's rivers because of their important roles as sources of water, commerce, etc. So, those facts are pretty well embedded. Some really fine work by a Professor Jenna Jambeck at the University of Georgia has been one of the mainstays of coming up with the analyses and the models and so forth that produce these figures. Now, if you start to looking at, okay, there's kind of two pieces. There's what's coming into the ocean, and then there's where it's going and how much of it is in different sections of the ocean. So you've probably all heard about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. A lot of attention paid to that. And it was a very good study in the last year or two, multiple authors doing a very sophisticated assessment of the plastic in the garbage patch. And this was very instructive on a number of reasons. And so the number they came up with was there was about 79,000 tons of plastic in the garbage patch itself. And of course, the garbage patch is the central North Pacific gyre, where for natural reasons, because the currents of the North Pacific circulate in a clockwise manner, the things that get into the North Pacific, offshore areas tend to congregate in the middle. And that's why a lot of the plastic ends up in this great gyre. Of that 79,000 tons, roughly half, almost equal amounts, were found to be, as you might expect, single-use plastics, mainly polyethylene, polyethylene phthalate, and polypropylene. Very low density, much less density than water, so they float very readily. Plastics, and of course that means they can float for a long time, which it can take weeks, months to get out into the gyre. The other half, also quite instructive, was fishing nets by volume, by mass. And that's, of course, the issue of abandoned and lost and otherwise, lost fishing nets, which is a huge problem as part of the overall plastics agenda. And again, most fishing nets are made of polyethylene type products too, so they're lightweight, they float quite easily, so when they escape, either they're lost from a ship or from another fishing mechanism, they can float and travel great distances and accumulate in these gyres. So, the numbers in the Great Gyre, 79,000 tons in the North Pacific. Now you compare that to 5 to 12 million tons coming in every year. There's a huge dichotomy between those numbers. I forget, it's around 0.1% or something is the amount in the North Pacific. So that says a very simple message that, in fact, most of the plastic coming into the oceans is not getting as far as these big central gyres. In fact, long-term work done in the North Atlantic, roughly similar, maybe about half, maybe I think about 40,000 metric tons of plastic is sitting in the North Atlantic. And interestingly, that volume has been roughly constant for about 30 years. It hasn't gone down, but it hasn't gone up either. And there's some interesting, instructive aspects of that as well. So it says a very clear message that a lot of the plastic that's coming off the continents as waste, lost waste, is not going far. It's staying in the coastal zone. It's obviously, we know, coming up on beaches in many cases and being, recirculated back into the ocean. And then another really important study done a few years, very recently by the Monterey Bay Aquarium in California. They did a much more in-depth survey of the distribution of plastic, not just in the surface, but throughout the water column and on the bottom, in fairly deep water, I think a couple thousand meters. And no big surprise, they found plastic distributed throughout the oceanic water column off the coast of California in quite deep water. And the volume that was in the below surface waters cumulatively exceeded that's in the amount that's in the surface water. So that said a lot about the fact that plastic is getting into deeper waters. And of course, the main reason this is happening is as it sits in the ocean, it gets what's called fouled, that is covered by algae, by bacteria, and that increases its density ever so slightly, that it promotes its sinking over time. In addition, the well-known fact that it's being broken down by sunlight, by wave action and so forth into progressively smaller and smaller particles, the so-called microplastics and so forth. And then, getting to the impacts, we know, of course, really up the entire oceanic food chain from some of the smaller feeding zooplankton, animal plankton, up until, of course, largest whales are being impacted by plastics because of this huge diversity in the size of plastic that's getting in the ocean, from very large things that that a whale might mistake for food, to the microplastics that a zooplankton might also mistake for food. There was just a study the other day that they determined that sea turtles, who are also known to ingest plastic and be damaged by it, they are attracted to the smell of the plastic, not because of the smell of the plastic, but of the biota, mainly bacteria, that are on it, because they emit certain gases such as dimethyl sulfide, which the sea turtles' nose are very attuned to, and they're attracted to it. So that's a very interesting new development. So let me think. That's most of this, not most, but an important sort of summary of the science of ocean-based plastic. How much is getting in? How much is there? Where it's going? And so forth. Let me go back to the North Atlantic. That story is also interesting. Really good work over literally several decades by the Sea Education Association in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. They've been sending college students out in the summers doing great work in the North Atlantic, including on plastics back when nobody was even thinking about this as being an issue. So they have like a 30+ year database. And as I mentioned, the amount in that sort of what we call standing stock in oceanography terms, the amount sort of standing in the Atlantic Ocean at any given time in the surface, has been roughly similar. And what that says to an oceanographer is that, because we know it's being removed for the reasons I just described a moment ago, that roughly the amounts being removed through natural settling due to increased density is roughly being balanced by the amounts coming in. And so it's sort of which you could call a steady state situation, which is not good because it's not going away by any means. And so, and that, of course, sends a very simple message that the amounts coming in to the North Atlantic, which obviously is from North America and Europe and parts of North Africa, are still significant. You see a lot of attention focused on East Asia as a hotspot of plastic. There's no question that's true, but there's also no question that the problem has by no means been solved to any great extent in some of the more developed parts of the world, particularly the United States, where the average recycling rate is on the order of 9%. Which is very, very low. All right, now let me touch now a little bit on strategies. We know this is an issue. It's a huge issue. It's a global issue. It affects all corners of the earth. Almost everywhere people have looked, have found plastic, from the deepest trenches to the North Pole. And so, I'm sure you've heard the concept of a circular economy, closing the loop. finding ways to not have a make take waste economy of linear single use and throwaway culture that we're basically in these days. And so there are a number of increasing number of proven and innovative ideas and approaches to managing the plastics economy, so to speak. I'll give a couple of, obvious examples, which I'm sure you're familiar with, is just simply bans. Things like plastic bags. And there's been a number of countries and municipalities around the world that have banned plastic bags to some good effect. Some of the bans have succeeded, some have not. And of course, it's a matter of putting in appropriate substitutes, alternative bags, making those available. Issues of whether you charge for them or not, incentivizing consumers to bring these kind of reusable bags when they shop, these kind of things. But there's a generally strong movement in this area. And I think in countries where this has worked, you've seen measurable reductions in the existence of plastic bag waste in the oceans and on beaches. UK, for example, did a study that clearly demonstrated that plastic bag bans were in fact working. Another area I'm a big fan of because they're highly effective is what are known as container deposit laws. Or in the United States, these are known as bottle bills. And these are very simple concepts, but very profound and effective. Is you buy a Coca-Cola or another soft drink or a bottle of water in the market, and it comes with a deposit on it that you pay when you pay for that product. It's usually in the U.S. only around 5 cents. One state has 10 cents. Europe, the countries that have it more at 10, 15, 20, 25 euro cents. And basically what happens is when you return that bottle to a redemption center, which are usually in the same supermarkets you would buy them from, you get back your deposit. You put it in a machine, or it can be done manually, and you get a little voucher that kind of gives you a nickel or a dime or 25 cents or whatever for each bottle you redeem. And these things work very well. Just give you some statistics. In the United States, the 9 states that have 5-cent deposits, which are places like here in New York, California, Washington State, a few others, they tend to get about a 40 to 60% return rate on bottles, which is pretty good. You go to Michigan, who has a 10-cent deposit, they get a 94% return rate. So it's very good, and it shows that little increment can make a huge difference. You go to Germany and Netherlands and Norway and so forth in Europe, who have 25 euro cent deposit, they typically have 98% return rates on these bottles, as no one is willing to throw away a quarter and wishes to get back the redemption thing. Now, the other really important point about container deposit laws is the burden, the financial burden on these is, of course, not borne by the customer because it's dollar neutral. They get their money back as long as they play the game. And it also is not a burden on the municipality. The municipality does not pay for it. It is all paid for by the companies that make the materials. And this is what's known in the business as extended producer responsibility. It's just one example of it, but it's a very profound and important concept. Clearly, the European Union, I think, has gone the farthest in taking on and putting this concept into practice with things like container deposit laws. And of course, the idea of container deposit laws and mechanisms is certainly not unique to single-use bottles. It can be applied, for example, some ideas have talked about using it for fishing nets. I've seen proposals to bring it to single takeaway food, single-use takeaway food containers, to make those also return back. So it's a very profound concept. So we support it a lot here, the idea, certainly, and we're promoting it in a number of mechanisms. So, I'm trying to think where else. Yeah, I can maybe pause there for the moment, and that we can have a few questions, and then, and of course, that'll open up my mind, and I may bring back a few other ideas and success stories that we could pass. Actually, I'll do one other. Let me throw one other thing at you for digestion. Is I've thought about this a lot personally and professionally, and if you look at plastics pollution as what it is a global problem. It's everywhere. And not just in the oceans and the rivers, but also on land, of course. It's everywhere. Number two, it's a huge, literally multi-trillion-dollar global industry with a huge complex supply chain from the first, the origin of the plastics, which is of course fossil fuels, petrochemicals, to the manufacture of the resins, the polyethylene, the polypropylene, and the dozens of other resins by chemicals firms, and then of course the use of those resins in the whole range of a whole massive volume of plastic products, both pure plastic products like bottles, but also of course many products that contain partial plastic, but other materials as well. And so, a great example of addressing a global issue has been the history with the issue of ozone depleting substances in the Earth's atmosphere, chlorofluorocarbons and other substances. And of course, that was addressed some years ago with the Vienna Convention and the so-called Montreal Protocol to the Vienna Convention, which put in place bans of a lot of the chemicals that were doing that, and of course inspired and incentivized companies to come up with substitutes, non-ozone depleting substitutes. And that convention was a huge success. It actually succeeded over a number of years in reducing the emissions of ozone depleting substances sufficient to enough that, of course, the huge ozone hole and the general depletion of the Earth's ozone layer was slowed down significantly and ultimately reversed in terms of the ozone hole over the Antarctic. So this is a huge success story, and it just demonstrates, in this case, of how a global approach to also a huge global issue. Refrigerants is also a huge global industry. The approach that worked was a global legal framework, a global convention. And so it's really hard for me to avoid the inescapable conclusion that to truly tackle plastics and the circular economy, we also need a global legal framework along these same lines. That, for example, set certain standards, harmonize the standards for what plastics can even be produced, ones that are completely non-recyclable, some might have to be banned, and then of course to codify in law in governments as they implement their obligations under such a convention. Everything could be container deposit laws, it could be a lot of other mechanisms, but I think we need a truly harmonized framework to accomplish this huge task of cleaning up the oceans on plastic, because bans here and there are fine locally, they will help locally, they will contribute incrementally to the problem, but the chances of getting everyone to do the right thing at the same time are pretty small. And so that's where a global driver or mechanism such as a legal framework could come into play. So we've written a bit about that as well in our policy work here at UNDP. So yeah, okay. So, since I'm running out of breath and my throat's getting parched, I'll take a quick break and now invite any initial questions.
So Andrew, there are some questions in the chat, so maybe we'll start by those, and then if there are other questions, people can raise their hand. I see that Alex A raised her hand. So the first question was from Francesca Saldana. Which countries are the main contributors to plastics in the sea?
Right. So, based on these estimates, and you should understand most of these things some are based on actual measurements, but it's hard to measure the amount of plastic leaving a given location in any really accurate sense. So a lot of them are based on very sophisticated, which include things like the quality of waste management and how that translates to expected plastic releases. So, you'll probably see in the news a lot of attention being focused on some large Asian countries, China, Thailand, Indonesia, and so forth. And it's no big surprise that these are some of the bigger sources for simple reasons. A, they're highly populated, very large populations, large population densities. They're very coastal countries. Indonesia, the Philippines, and others are archipelagic countries. They're island countries. So most people live on or near the ocean. And then, of course, most of these countries are developing countries that have not put in place very advanced waste management regimes, just even standard municipal waste collection as a means to try to better manage and reduce the loss of waste to the environment. As I said kind of earlier, every country has this issue, from the smallest island state in the Pacific to even, still the United States still has a huge issue with this. I ride a train along the Hudson River every day, and I see tons of plastic along the shores and along the train tracks, which are right adjacent to the river. So it's by no means a problem solved here. So that's okay on that question.
And then we have another question from Josh from Cello. Container deposit rules sound very effective. Why aren't they implemented more widely?
And I love that question because it's a thing I've been wondering myself for quite some time. It's a hugely successful approach, and it's largely in the West. It's in Europe. It's in the United States to some degree. It's in Canada. It's in Australia. I think Japan may have it. But I did an inventory about like a year ago, and at that time at least, the number that had been tried in the developing world was you could count on single fingers. It was a few small island states. In fact, it was mostly small island states. And I know, for example, Barbados had tried it, and it was working for a while. They were having hugely successful collection rates. Their problem was they didn't have the recycling infrastructure or the economy of scale to handle it. And so they tried to drum up a kind of more cooperative effort with other island states in the Caribbean, and that basically ran into political problems. How are we going to do it? Who's responsible for this and that? So as far as I understood, it got kind of stymied. Although I did see an article just the other day that it appears the container deposit law in Barbados is maybe being revisited and being maybe resurrected to some degree, so that's positive. But I'm certainly keen personally and within our work in UNDP is to exactly do that, to introduce and test and pilot and experiment with container deposit laws in the developing world, because there's a whole nother aspect to it. Is I'm sure you're aware in some countries and in many countries these days, they're so-called trash pickers, or people who of course sort through both waste in waste baskets, but also waste in the environment to get out not only plastic but metal and glass. For conglomerating, and then of course trying to sell it to bottlers and other entities that take these things. But these these trash picking can keep these people out of poverty, or at least not as bad poverty, because they can get a revenue stream. But the revenue stream, I believe, is basically very low, because they're basically selling recyclable product into a wholesale market. And of course, the value of recyclables remains very, very low, particularly for plastic, where virgin plastic made from petrochemicals is still very, very cheap, and so is much more attractive to the manufacturers. And so, the other thing container deposit laws can do is provide more substantive incomes to the poor. I mean, you walk around New York City, you won't find a plastic bottle anywhere, for the simple reason that if anyone throws one away, it is immediately picked up, sadly, but truly, by a homeless person, because they can get that 5-cent deposit back as a bit of tiny income for them. So, and the other thing is, I think was Michigan did a study a few years ago. Their container deposit law, which as I mentioned was one of the most successful at 10 cents, they did a study on how it affected jobs, and they found that it created a net 5,400 jobs in the state of Michigan were created by their container deposit law. So it shows that not only a really workable way to clean up the environment and reduce the flow of plastic pollution, but they can create jobs and reduce poverty.
Follow-up question to that. This is Josh. This all sounds amazing. You said there's only like 10 states in the United States that do it. So like, even regardless of developing world, which would be amazing to get on board, why aren't the 40 other states in the United States doing this? It seems like an easy sell. Like, is it just not been proposed, or like what?
It does. No, it had. In fact, I don't know the details, but I know many, many states over the years have attempted to bring forward bottle bills, from Tennessee to others. And, the real story behind it is that most of those efforts get blocked by the industry, the bottling industry, because for them, it does create a small, I guess for them, meaningful cost. Although one study I saw said on average, the implementation and financing of a bottle bill in the United States adds about 1 penny per container to the bottom line of the companies. which is not to me. And of course, they've done studies. Did bottle bills hurt sales of bottled drinks in the states that have them? And the answer is no, they did not at all. People still buy the products, of course. So sadly, it's an issue with private sector lobbying, and obviously there's money involved. So it's a big issue. I met some years ago a New York State Assemblyman who pretty much was behind getting the New York State bottle bill through the New York State legislature many years ago, in the 70s or early 80s, I think it was. He told me, I asked him about it, he told me it took him 10 years to get that bill pushed through the New York State Assembly. So that just shows the powers and the barriers that are up there. But I think there's a new U.S. federal legislation that's being pushed, trying to push through Congress, that is a broad-based effort to address, among other things, ocean plastics pollution. And I'm pretty sure it includes, and I guess this would be at a federal level, which would be exciting, a container deposit law option or possibility. So that would be an interesting bill to continue to monitor.
Cool, thanks.
Yep.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, I have so many questions, and I joined late, so I had to do some research on UNDP just so I can get the full context. I had a question on the gyres and the studies that you've seen. Has there been a study on what's directly underneath the gyre? I was figuring that there might be an accumulation there that is much larger than has been thought of before.
Right, good point. I know, I'm almost positive the study that was done, that was published about 2 years ago, only looked at the surface. I don't think they had the technologies to go deeper. It's a very good point. Yeah, it could indeed be that a comparable or possibly even larger volume is indeed there below the gyre in the Pacific. The Monterey Bay study, as far as I know, was the first to take various remote autonomous robots and other kinds of sampling equipment, very expensive, very sophisticated, to do a true inventory of the plastics load that's sitting in the water column. But I'm an oceanographer by training, and it seems very clear to me that, and it's just logical, that once this stuff is in the ocean, and especially if it gets beyond the coastal zone, which, as I said, a minority does, but that minority is a big minority. That, of course, over time, filters down and fills. I could predict you could probably go anywhere in the ocean, or almost anywhere, at least the first 1,000 meters of the ocean, and take a sample, and you could find plastic in it.
Thank you.
And I see Stan Chen mentioned, the Udall, that was the senator or the congressman behind it. Lowenthal bill includes plaza laws. Thank you, Stan, for that's what's happening with that. So that would be extremely exciting if that could happen. Vanessa, should I look at these and just dive in myself, or do you want to lead the choice of questions to work on?
Well, it's Daria here, so I think Vanessa is on mute, but I think there is a question from Gustavo. So he's asking, is recycling a short-term solution to the problem, and other public policies that reduce the production of plastics?
Right. I think recycling is certainly part of the short-term solution, but the key word in your question is reduce. We obviously need to find ways to close the loop and recycle the plastics that we have to use, but obviously anywhere opportunities to reduce the volume of plastics used in products, number one, the amount of plastics that is recyclable versus non-recyclable, that's a very important issue. I mean, I think it's probably many of you know that in the United States, you put your plastic waste into the into the bin for carting away by your municipal waste management, and this goes supposedly to recycling facilities. But we know that A, much of the plastic we receive in our day-to-day living isn't recyclable, and B, much of it that even gets to the facilities either isn't recyclable or is fouled. If it has food stuff on it, the machine's going to reject it almost immediately, and other barriers to effectiveness. So this all loops back into what I mentioned before, this extended producer responsibility concept. This is so pivotal that the ultimate ownership of the responsibility and the cost for recovering, ultimately, either reusing or recycling plastic and plastic-containing materials must lie with the companies that are producing the materials. I think that's really a critical aspect. I noticed Gustavo mentioned, is there a per-country scorecard measuring progress on SDGs? Very good question. I'm not sure if there's something public yet, although I'm sure there are organizations doing their best on certain SDGs. But more fundamentally, the SDGs each have a usually a UN agency that has, what do they call it? The custodian for that SDG, and that includes. Notice you can go to every SDG and it has an indicator. So I knew the ocean ones and the water ones quite well. So for example, for plastics, it's something about along the lines of an index of plastic density in coastal waters. And so, different UN agencies such as IOC, UNESCO, and UNEP, and IMO, and others are assigned to be the custodians, which means they don't have to measure these things. That would be impossible. But they have to come up with the methodologies or support countries in developing the methodologies to begin to monitor progress on SDGs at a national level. SDGs ultimately are reportable and trackable at a national level. So whether it's oceans or any other SDG, the indicators for that SDG are ultimately what countries will be expected to be reporting on as we go forward.
And there was also a question earlier, I think, from Susan. So in South Africa, there are projects where they use plastic bottles for building, like as bricks. So, and she's wondering if it's effective and could be incentivized. And we actually have similar projects in UNDP because in UN has it and UNDP has it, and we have something like this in Mongolia where they make there is an female entrepreneur who does furniture from plastic bottles, I think mostly, but maybe other plastic waste as well. But maybe, Andrew, you have larger kind of like an overall opinion about similar initiatives.
Yes. So, if you either collect or otherwise acquire waste plastic and then you basically remanufacture it into other items, whether they're could be bricks. I've seen people doing it into basically creating lumber, plastic lumber, handicrafts, furniture, etc. So in the jargon, that's often referred to as one cycling, right? It's not recycling. It's because recycling mainly means back into the same product. It's one cycling, and there's obviously advantages to that because obviously if you take a single-use plastic bottle that has a lifetime in the economy of maybe a few hours or a few days, and you turn it into a chair or a piece of lumber, which might sit in a house for decades or even hundreds of years, that obviously is going to reduce the risk that particular bit of plastic places on the environment of getting into the ocean or otherwise. So, I can certainly support those things. I don't think they're a comprehensive solution. And most of the projects involving that are people basically finding waste plastic, either even directly from the ocean or from rivers, and doing certain processes to convert it into usable, longer lasting products. It's all fine, but it's not going to solve the problem comprehensively because it doesn't do anything about reducing the flow, the amount of plastic that's still getting into the environment. And that's where these issues with producer responsibility, circular economy, really check in of creating the strongest incentives to really bring plastic back to where they came from.
I'm sharing just some links on what has been mentioned in the chat. So I think you addressed all the questions. So if anyone feels like they still have a question, maybe, and if it's the same that you posted before, if you don't mind just sending it to the chat again, so it's at the bottom, because I think that we discussed everything. Oh yeah, there is one
Actually,
more.
this is Susie from Blockchain for Social Impact. Thank you so much, both of you, Daria and Andrew. Perhaps it would be helpful to add in the chat some resources that UNDP and you in particular, Andrew, that your go-to resources for plastics, all things plastics.
Okay, we can put up a little bit. I think we have some blogs we've authored over the last couple of years, for example. And actually, one thing I wanted to mention, we can send the link for that, quite easy. Back in January, UNDP, we launched something called the Ocean Innovation Challenge. At the website's oceaninnovationchallenge.org. And this was basically a request for proposals, a global request for proposals, calling on entities in principle from all walks of life, from NGOs to governments to private companies to academia and others, to come up with innovations and related to the ocean. And this first one, we're hoping to have several, was focused on SDG 14.1, which is marine pollution. And of course, the two kind of biggest issues for pollution we cited in SDG 14.1 sites are plastics and nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus pollution in the ocean, which is also a huge, huge issue. And we were hoping we might get, maybe 100 to 200 proposals over the 2 months we had this open. We received, when we closed on March 5th, 609 proposals. We were just blown away and excited. And you're probably not too surprised. I would guess about 80% or more of them related to plastics. And so we're seeing a very wide range, a huge interest, number one, and a wide range of interesting ideas, cutting across things from container deposit laws to upcycling into other products and many, many other things. So over the next few months, we're going to scour through these hundreds of proposals, trying to find the best that we would finance under this Ocean Innovation Challenge. So I invite everyone to take a look at that. It's closed now for submissions for this particular round, but it is quite exciting. The other thing I wanted to mention, no, I guess that was it. Yeah, I just wanted to mention our challenge.
There is also a question from Alex about large corporations and if you think that they move in the needle to encourage global action.
Yeah. So yeah, there are definitely a number of large corporations, Unilevers, I think one of them, that are, have recognizes this a serious issue, and that they are in part, in some cases large part, responsible for it, and they need to take action. I haven't seen, well, I honestly haven't followed it so closely lately. Some of it you could argue is greenwashing. Some of these commitments, I won't name companies, but some sort of made sort of promises and set targets, but those promises and targets don't necessarily involve them taking both operational and financial responsibility for their products. So it's still, I think, very much a work in progress. But the general mood and tendency for the private sector to start to take note of this issue, I think, is quite good. And then there's another question about Nigeria has no extended producer responsibility laws. Plastic production rates keep increasing enormously. What would be the best step to get these laws implemented to control these rates? Wow, that is a very, very good question. Well, exactly. You can have, in some cases, have laws on the books, but they're not being implemented. And, this is about political will, about creating incentives, about enforcement, compliance and enforcement issues, very complex issues, no question. And this is where the innovation is required. We need, it's not necessarily the same solution for every country. Different countries have very different country contexts, politically, economically, culturally, etc. So the solution for one country may not be exactly the same as that for another country. One example, the Pacific Islands have a huge issue with plastics washing up in their beaches. Now, they're definitely producing some, certainly the tourist industry is producing some, but it's pretty clear that a lot of it's not from them. It's coming from the huge burden of plastics coming off the Asian continent. And so, you know, they face a very serious external challenge, which they have to address. And I know one idea that's come up, at least for their local issues, is to revert to what was the case not too many years ago, not just in the Pacific, but in the whole world, is back to glass. Which of course is an infinitely recyclable and non-toxic means of carrying around a beverage. Now it has a downside too, of course, because it has a higher fossil fuel footprint if it's being shipped over great distances, just because of the extra weight of the glass. But again, it's something that each country has to take into account in their conversations.
Yeah, I think Andrew, so the last one is about the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, and you have an opinion about that.
Okay, maybe if Stan's on here, if you could just give me a quick reminder. I know of it, but I can't say who's in it right now. Can you give me a quick reminder who the stakeholders are in this particular effort?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So the Alliance to End Plastic Waste is the alliance that was set up by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And I know a lot of the SABIC, Dow, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Coca-Cola have all signed up. You know, essentially the large brand owners and petrochemical corporations have signed up as, for the most part, as the initial signatories and the members of the alliance. I have been talking with them. I do know them, a few of the stakeholders personally. But it's a very, very large pledge in terms of like the funds that they're putting in to fund supposed projects. But right now, I think they're focusing most of their efforts in the Southeast Asian area. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts on them were and how effective they could be as a mostly industry-only collaboration.
All right, thanks, Dan. You've clearly followed this more closely than I have. I mean, obviously the players you named are major players in the production of plastic-containing products, so they obviously need to be part of the discussion. Yeah, as you allude to, it's very much about what do they really commit to do. There's ways to do it in a very greenwashy kind of way, and that can include throwing money at it, because for some of these companies, tens of millions of dollars is nothing. It's very much a matter of not just the amount and the intent, but the actual action. As I've said now too many times, the more companies can commit to truly embedding the extended producer responsibility principle in their work, I think the longer term success will have. And that gets back to my suggestion of the need for a global framework, because I'm sure all the companies in there are huge multinationals that are distributing and manufacturing plastic products in probably almost every country on Earth. And so, this gets back to in my view, the need for a truly harmonized global approach to the issue, where ultimately these companies would be legally bound to obey certain principles in everything from resins that can be used, recyclability, recovery and reuse mechanisms, and so forth. And I'll be, being very honest. I mean, to put forward and negotiate and complete such a convention it might even make climate change seem straightforward. It would be extremely complex and extremely, it could be quite difficult to push it through, because it would put a great deal of aegis and responsibility upon these companies to take responsibility. But I truly believe in the long run, at least, that may be the best approach. But we shall see. And just on that last note, there has been at least two developments in the UN system on that note. The United Nations Environment Assembly of UNEP, I think last year, adopted a resolution to basically, continue a discussion and to further explore this idea of a global legal framework, number one. And then number two, I think later last fall, all five Nordic countries, Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, etc., their ministers of environment adopted a resolution of some type, joint resolution, calling for the world to begin a process toward a global legal framework on plastic.
Oh, wow, I just wanted to say that I think that was that were all the questions, and there is last comment that's okay.
Miss Esquiria, biggest shift would be causation and accountability for harmful plastics. There are new replacements popping up, but the cost to drive at scale is still relatively high and consumers wouldn't foot the bill. Is it purely a waiting game, or what is UNDP's role in bridging this gap awareness, or what opportunity do you see for acceleration adoption? Wow, that's a very good question. Yeah, I think it's very early days on the kind. Well, she mentions replacements popping up. That may be the case. I haven't seen too much of that. Certainly, ideas of, for example, biologically derived plastics replacements, and this gets into the whole also very complex issue of biodegradable materials. I've seen some things that are very questionable, where people are talking about using biological feedstocks, but still to create plastics. And once you create the polymers that are plastics, they still have the same properties that plastics made from petrochemicals are. So if you just use biological materials to make plastics, you're not really, the only thing you're solving is the demand on fossil fuel resources, which is a good thing, but you're not solving a plastic pollution problem. And then biodegradability, very tricky issue, because if you make a new container or other material, food packaging that's quote unquote biodegradable, the question is how biodegradable it is and how fast, and does it lose the properties that the plastic had of safety and protection from oxygen, from bacteria and the things that can cause food to go bad. It was this whole issue of biodegradable plastic I find to be a very tricky one. And so I personally don't necessarily, want to call for the complete elimination of plastic. That's literally impossible, although some have called for that. But again, finding ways to truly close the loop and bring plastic back to where it came from, so it can be either remanufactured or reused. And then we have Jennifer. How do you ensure that countries and companies are actually accurately reporting plastic production waste rates? Well, I don't think most countries are doing that in any systematic way. Or most of the estimates I've seen have been by academics, trying to suss out the plastic burden coming from different countries and regions of the world. Companies, and Stan may be able to address this question better than me, but I'm not specifically aware of which companies are reporting on their plastic production and or their waste generation. And they probably don't want to take responsibility for the waste generation component. Then Stan came back. There's a question of valuation against SDGs to accelerate the deployment of capital. Are there any effort to quantify the economic impacts of these environmental externalities into the cost of products? That's a very good broad question as well. Certainly on plastics, I mean, the only environmental impact cost estimate I've seen so far was done by UNEP. It was about $13 billion per year is the economic cost of plastics. And I think everyone accepts that's a vast underestimate of the total cost, because it didn't take into account a number of potential issues and impacts of plastic, but it's a start. And don't forget, what Stan's question raises is that this is all about internalizing the externality of plastics, making sure that the cost of plastics pollution is eliminated by embedding the cost of effective plastic management in the cost of goods. Absolutely. And so if it means certain goods cost a little more to ensure certain changes, that may be something the world has to live with. But that's a fundamental of environmental economics, that you must, if you want to solve environmental problems, you must embed the environmental cost of doing the right thing into the cost of goods.
Yeah, I think so. These are all the questions. I don't know, Vanessa, are you online?
Vanessa had to hop off, but I'm taking her place. If that's all the questions we have, I want to thank you, Daria and Andrew, for a great, intellectually stimulating conversation, given, we're in the midst of so many other things, but I want to thank the participants, mentors, board members, and advisors, and hackers who are on the call. And we'll have this recording posted in the Gitcoin chat for those who want to revisit it or disseminate to others who weren't able to join. And
as I mentioned, I will put together a list of links and some what Andrew referred to, and then there are some links in the chat, and then Vanessa can send a follow-up message to everyone with all this information.
Great, and again, we want to thank you and Robert and Yolanda for being terrific partners to BASIC and this hackathon. Thank you so much to UNDP.
Thank you guys. Great meeting everybody and talking to everybody.
Great.